We know the grid is undergoing massive change, which creates massive opportunities for local energy. The Energy Changemakers podcast offers rich conversations with industry leaders to help you and your company capture opportunities to build the decentralized grid. I'm your host, Elisa Wood. Welcome to the Energy Changemakers podcast. Hey everyone, Elisa Wood here from Energy Changemakers. Today we're going to talk about how the power industry should read the DeepSeek announcement. DeepSeek is a Chinese company that in late January announced it had developed a more efficient AI large language model, one that purports to perform as well as US models while requiring only a fraction of the computing power and therefore a lot less electricity. This is a big deal because the power industry has been planning and investing based on the idea that AI is going to increase electric demand significantly. So, following DeepSeek's announcement, I wanted to talk to someone who has a deep understanding of data centers, cloud computing, and AI. Someone who could help us, an energy audience, understand what's actually happening in the AI industry. I was very fortunate that Rich Miller agreed to come on the show today. Few people out there have a broader or deeper understanding of the data center landscape than Rich. He's the founder and former editor of both Data Center Knowledge and Data Center Frontier, two very successful publications. So Rich, hello, how are you?
I'm doing great, Elisa. It's really good to be with you.
It's great to have you here. We have so much to talk about today. Let's kind of set the stage for our listeners. You are a data center expert, and our audience are energy folk. And so if you could just start by talking a little bit about kind of the pre-DeepSeek world, like the notion that AI was going to really increase electricity demand. Well, how did it change kind of your world? What was happening there?
Well, energy has always been the lifeblood of any data center. And so the relationship between the growth of data and the power to support it has always been a major theme in the data center industry. Going back from the very beginning of it, many things in the business have been driven by the availability and cost of power. We've really seen a lot of growth in the data center industry over the past 15 years. It's kind of a young industry, but the kickoff of the serious growth has been cloud computing, which started back in the late aughts, I guess, but really has kicked into gear over the last 10 years. And interestingly, when cloud computing first became a thing and we started to see a very rapid growth, there were a lot of concerns then that it would consume all the electricity that was available and that there would be this crisis from data centers and using up utility power. What wound up happening is that at the same time, the industry was getting a lot of pressure about sustainability, about efficiency. And so as the cloud grew and really created an exponential increase in the data computing capability and the digital infrastructure and services to support really a lot that was going on in our economy, there really wasn't much of an increase in power. I think from like 2013 to 2020, there was only about a 5 to 7% increase in the power used by data centers, when meanwhile there was this, I think it was a 550% increase in the amount of compute capacity that was brought online in that time.
Interesting.
Yeah, and this is, I think, one of the stories when we look at, for a lot of years, the data centers have been growing very rapidly, even though the amount of energy used and demanded from utilities, there hasn't been a lot of demand growth. And a lot of that has been because the data center industry has been growing powerfully, but been really applying technology and innovation to be as efficient as possible. These facilities, the big ones, are run by the largest technology companies on earth. They have the most money, the most sophistication, and there was, a really alignment of incentives here where being able to use less power was good for their bottom line. And so in a way, even though the cloud revolution was a very powerful in terms of remaking the digital landscape to the point where we saw during COVID where very suddenly, pretty much the entire economy and much of society could move operations online and make it work. And all that wasn't that disruptive to the relationship between the data centers and energy.
That's so fascinating because that's a topic we get into in Energy Changemakers community quite a bit. I think I mentioned to you earlier when we were talking before the show that there's kind of the bears and the bulls in terms of whether or not we're going to see this big increase in electricity demand. And one of the things the bears often point out is that we've seen this happen before where tech and computing is growing and there's concerns that the amount of electricity needed will be beyond what can be supplied. But then the industry becomes more and more efficient and therefore doesn't need as much. So the forecasts are off. And I guess they're kind of projecting that this will happen again with AI.
Well, I think there's some significant differences between the cloud revolution, which is really, I think, a good template for examining what's happening with the AI wave here. And there's sort of a couple of things have changed. First, the internet goes faster than the power grid, and even by technology standards, AI moves very quickly. And
Mm.
it's a different kind of process than all of the computing services that we've typically used to deploy the cloud applications. It's very data intensive. It requires huge volumes of data to train. Essentially, when OpenAI started launching its models, as best as we can tell, they were pretty much kind of ingesting the whole internet and all sorts of other things and
Mhm.
using all of that to try and train their models and help them learn. So there's a lot of data management on the back end that requires data crunching. And then the whole process of taking those models, asking questions, the sort of inference piece of this, where it takes the prompt that you give it and it tries to make decisions and return things. There's a lot of compute horsepower that goes into that. And so it requires much more powerful technology. And this has been, the reason that people talk about NVIDIA a lot nowadays is they
Mhm.
came up with these GPU chips that have been much more powerful than the traditional CPUs made by like Intel or AMD. And they became important in supercomputing and high performance computing. And then once AI began to make advances, the technology really began to scale up. You could use the NVIDIA chips to accomplish things that weren't really conceivable before. But at the same time, you need a lot of them. And what happened is, as folks dug into this, they found that AI can be a real thing, but it is going to take a lot of hardware. And a lot of hardware means a lot of data centers. And so that's why the energy expectation has changed. I've been tracking the supersizing of data centers for a long time. And this has been a fairly steady process going back to 2015. About every 3 years or so, the size and the power draw for data centers has been just about doubling. In short, the AI is much more data and energy intensive. It can accomplish huge things, but has huge resource requirements. So this has really
Mhm.
reset some of the baseline trends that we've seen in terms of the amount of power, the size of data center facilities, and simply because these companies are trying to accomplish much more ambitious things in harnessing AI to, I just do just about everything, it seems.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the parallel isn't really there between what happened with cloud computing and the industry becoming more efficient and not needing as much electricity as had been expected and this new AI trend. It's very different.
Yeah, and the other thing is that it's like many of in terms of efficiency, a lot of the low hanging fruit has kind of been captured.
Mm.
When we've gotten to this point of the cloud revolution, these data centers are extraordinarily energy efficient, and it's hard to like get more in the way of gains. And we'll see some. There'll be a lot of that, but not like before.
You said something else. I think you were touching on the idea that I think this is true anyway. Let me know that data centers can be constructed a lot more quickly than power infrastructure than gas-fired plants typically or renewable energy. We're seeing, for instance, right now we have like a long delay in getting a lot of the infrastructure, the turbines and whatnot. So, my impression is this true? I'm asking you, is it true that it's quicker to construct data centers than it typically is in this highly regulated power industry?
The short answer to that is yes. And one of the things that has happened there that has changed is that as data center requirements became large enough that they really acquired, they were sort of maxing out parts of grids in very busy data center markets. Northern Virginia was the first place we saw this back in 2022, where Dominion Energy, it felt like it was out of the blue to the industry anyway, came and said, well, we're really not able to give you more power because it's not a generation problem, it's a transmission problem. It's that the
Mm-hmm.
regional transmission system can no longer accommodate moving all of the power to Data Center Alley and Ashburn and the area around there. And once you move from building substations to building transmission lines, you're dealing with entirely different timelines. And that has happened at pretty much exactly the time that these requirements are scaling way up. And, when people talking about gigawatt data center campuses, it used to be 10 megawatts, then it was 100 megawatts was a big one. The last couple of years, we have a lot of people talking about 300 to 500 megawatt requirements as sort of the baseline for folks who want to provide a data center campus for the Microsofts and Googles and Amazons of the world. And, when that's happening across the board, the utilities in many of these markets have struggled to be able to find where they're going to have that capacity available on the timelines that these folks want.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up transmission because it's so hard to build transmission for a whole lot of reasons. But one reason, too, is there's so much opposition.
Yep.
I see that all the time. And I'm in Virginia, and so I'm watching the local news all the time. And there's just so much opposition to building transmission here. The other thing that is really, I think, interesting about the energy side of things, you mentioned Northern Virginia. It seems like, if I understand correctly, this big increase in demand from data centers that is projected is really pretty localized in the US. And Northern Virginia is one of the key areas. Is that correct?
It is, and that's changing very quickly as a result of all that's going on right now. Generally, data center demand has been focused in, initially, it was about 5 or 6 large markets across the United States. And basically, that tracked the large business markets where all the networks meet. Northern Virginia, obviously, being one of the key meeting places, Silicon Valley, Chicago, Dallas, Phoenix has become a very large market. And because of there are economies of scale for building these facilities, and everybody wants to connect with everybody else's data centers. So you would see these large clusters being created around network intersections, like there is in Ashburn there in Northern Virginia. What has happened over the past year or two since we started having the power constraints in Northern Virginia is all of a sudden, rather than following the network, data center development is now following the power. So everybody's looking at these larger requirements and trying to figure out where they can find the power and how quickly they can find it. Given the growth of AI and the urgency with which the hyperscalers want to deploy it, speed to market is the coin of the realm. And so everybody's looking at places where they can get to power quickly and build and deploy. I mean, there was a great example of this on Microsoft's earnings call last week, where essentially they said, well, our cloud growth was a little less than we thought it would have been simply because we could not get the data center capacity to deploy as much AI and cloud business as we have available to us, which is an interesting state of affairs. And I think we're going to see more of that over the next couple of years as data centers struggle to find the power that they need to keep up with some of the consumer demands, particularly if this scales up the way many of the AI bulls envision.
So, what parts of the country are they finding power? Is that tend to be the Southeast? Where are they centering now?
There's a few really interesting trends there. The Southeast has become a big destination. It was pretty much a blank space on the data center map for a long time. When Northern Virginia began to have constraints, a lot of projects moved to Atlanta, and Georgia is pretty much is close to being maxed out now on power with the projects that are already in the pipeline. So over the past year, we've seen very large projects being announced in Louisiana and Mississippi, and even Arkansas. I think there's a large project. Indiana in the Midwest has always been kind of a dead spot for development, even though some of the other states around it had grown very quickly. But now there's been a ton of developments coming to Indiana. The Northeast, because of power pricing, tended not to be a very large hyperscale market, but now there's a number of very large developments planned for Pennsylvania, and the big Stargate project from OpenAI and Oracle has just said that they're going to be looking for locations in
Interesting.
Pennsylvania. So the data center geography is changing very quickly, and this has been an opportunity for a lot of states that maybe coveted economic development. It has changed the map a little bit for the data centers. We're seeing projects in places where you never would have seen them just a couple of years ago.
That's fascinating. It seems like there's a lot of kind of ancillary headaches that this whole issue is causing with the power sector. We're hearing complaints about data centers buying up all of the renewable energy contracts and leaving nothing left, for others. Or the concern that if they really spike demand, that consumer prices are going to go way up. And some people are even worried about consumer reliability, residential reliability, because of data centers.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about how data centers are addressing those concerns? What are some of the things they're doing?
In terms of the community concerns and the industry concerns?
Yeah, I guess what I'm asking is, are data center operators, developers, are they changing their energy strategies in any way because of some of these concerns?
Well, there's some interesting history on data centers and energy, and particularly renewable energy. In the early days, sustainability wasn't really a big priority. But starting around 2013 or 2014, suddenly Greenpeace kind of got in their face a bit about building large data centers powered by fossil fuels. They had a whole campaign with Facebook saying, Mark Zuckerberg, unfriend dirty coal, and as a result, over the past 10 years, the hyperscale data center operators have been some of the largest corporate buyers of renewable energy. And several of the players, I think particularly Google, have targeted their strategies to try and incentivize the development of new renewable energy by becoming ready buyers for large volume contracts. So the data center industry has been, I think, a very large and progressive player in the renewable energy and sustainability field. So I do think it's kind of interesting now that people are like, oh, well, the data centers want renewable energy, that they shouldn't get access to it. It's like, well, they've kind of been important players in helping develop this ecosystem. So it's interesting that now folks think that they should step back.
I think the concern is not so much that they should step back, but I think the concern is that, I'm a Walmart or whoever, and I also have sustainability goals, and there's only so much renewable energy being built. And if the data centers gobble up all the contracts, I'll have trouble reaching my goals. So I think that's kind of where the tension lies. I think everybody loves to see them, loves to see the data centers use renewables. But another question I have about that is, my world loves distributed energy. And I'm curious if
Right.
you're seeing much of a push towards on-site energy for data centers.
That is the $1 million question. And in fact, that is the most important trend that I think we are seeing right now, largely because we have this sort of logjam where many data center operators want much more energy than it looks like they're going to be able to get from the utilities in the short term. So in the past, data centers were never very eager to to get into the energy business themselves. That has completely changed over the last 18 months. Almost all of the large data center operators are working on on-site energy options, a lot of them involving, natural gas, but also, they're providing long-term projects that they're starting
Mm-hmm.
about small modular reactors as well. And the reason for this is simply because when you look at the delays in interconnecting to the grid, there's huge backlogs in a lot of places, particularly PJM.
Mm-hmm.
And when you get to that speed to market that's so important for the data centers, a lot of them now believe that the quickest way to accomplish that is to have either dedicated projects built for them to support their campuses or to help build them themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Google just announced a big partnership with a renewable energy company to deploy campuses backed by clean energy, where they're co-locating the renewables with the data center. And some of these humongous new projects we've been seeing many of them have a component where they're either working with, companies that are building natural gas plants for them, or now there's a couple of the old school energy companies, Exxon and Chevron, now are targeting the data center industry with, programs to provide natural gas on-site energy, typically running behind the meter. And for data centers, this is a new focus. But when you look at the state of the delays that are being envisioned, partly because of the transmission log jams and the interconnection problems, and the public opposition to just about all of the expansion of energy for data centers, the internet was built to route around problems, and there are precedents for these giant technology companies sort of taking over pieces of the operations that weren't, traditionally their core competence. I mean, the precedent that I look at is subsea cables. It used to be that subsea communications cables were built by consortiums of telecom companies, and they designed them around their needs. Now it's all the hyperscale data center operators are largely, funding. Some of them are building their own. Google pretty much builds its own subsea cables now and brings them in, to landing stations near their data center campuses. And that's a huge expansion of their business to take over a piece of critical infrastructure that wasn't part of what they do.
Wow. So that's that's interesting. That sounds like it would be very threatening to the utilities if data centers, given their access to capital, can sort of figure out how to do all this on their own. I would be very worried if I were a utility in their territory.
Well, here's just a data point on that, which is that one of the things that came out last week, all of the hyperscalers have been building up their energy operations and staffing up in very large ways there, as well as some of the very largest developers, the third party providers. But last week, Microsoft was posting jobs for specialists in energy transmission. They're looking for specialists for transmission infrastructure. I think a lot of this is looking globally and trying to get ahead of the game in countries where they think they're going to be building a lot of data centers in the future, but also obviously to try and address some of the bottlenecks that are going on now. So when there's the thing about, you mentioned the capital requirements, right at this point, the data center industry and AI is being heartily embraced by the largest institutional
Mm-hmm.
investors on the face of the earth. Blackstone being the most obvious example, where they own two or three data center companies now. They're buying data storage. They see digital infrastructure for AI as the big business opportunity and investment opportunity going forward. And they have, trillions of dollars in assets that they can apply. So, they just bought a power plant in Northern Virginia near Data Center Alley in Leesburg. It's supposedly about $1 billion deal, and there's a lot of interest in what's going to happen there, because they also own a data center company that's going to be building a lot of capacity locally.
Interesting.
And so it's a new frontier. The notion that these companies and the priority about AI changes the game in a lot of ways. When you have companies with the largest budgets on earth, they're able to think about doing things in ways that haven't been done before without capital necessarily being the constraint.
That could radically change the utility industry. That is fascinating. Let's talk about the big story at hand now, which is DeepSeek.
Deep sea.
Yeah, DeepSeek. So, this is really I'm on a lot of energy listservs, and this has sparked just so much discussion on those listservs with again, the bears and the bulls, and the bears saying, I told you so. We're not going to need all that power. And the bulls saying, oh, I'm not so sure about that. So what do you, Rich Miller, think?
So my training as a journalist is that I always try to drill down. I think every time you have a big event like this, that's a disruption, you see some people that react very strongly, and you tend to see the initial reactions are often kind of polarized. And I think that's what we've seen. I always find the truth is pretty much somewhere in the middle, and I think that's absolutely what's going to wind up being the case with DeepSeek. There's no question that this Chinese company being able to roll out this surprisingly good model and making some claims about that were also surprising about what it cost them to develop it has really unsettled a lot of people's assumptions around how much, what the future of AI is going to look like and what it's going to cost. I think there's some apples and oranges in there in terms of what they were revealing and what probably actually went into the model. But the short version is that there's always huge investments in compute, and the energy to power it have assumed that it's going to take this enormous amount of horsepower to train these models and to make them productive. What DeepSeek did is, in finding some more efficient ways to develop their models, they have suggested that there are lots of ways to improve on that and to be more economical with the use of compute and with energy. And that sort of is coming just as we're seeing people saying they want to spend $500 billion building, 5 gigawatt data center campuses.
Mm-hmm.
So the markets took this as kind of like an reset on the AI trade. I think people have been a little bit in the financial markets have been a little, hesitant about that for a while now, and wondering whether this is, getting a little bubblicious here.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not surprising. But I think there's two things that are worth noting here about DeepSeek and what it means. There's sort of two pieces to this. One is, does this really reset the technology requirements for AI? And the answer there, I think, is that this is clearly a disruption, and that they have found some new things that very quickly are going to allow a better and more efficient AI models. At the same time, it also creates a sort of a geopolitical dynamic that offers sort of another take on this, which is a lot of the reason that we've seen the sort of national political prioritization of AI and some of these large data center projects being announced from the White House. Man, I never thought I'd see anything like that. But is because the notion of a sort of global sort of battle over technology leadership and who's going to have the lead in AI. And in that way, a Chinese company, bringing out these kind of performance advances also freaked folks out a little bit in some parts of particularly the US AI industry. And so there's really a couple of narratives that we need to kind of balance out here. One is, does this really say something has fundamentally changed about the amount of hardware that's needed for AI, and thus the amount of energy that will be required? And I think the short-term answer of that is somewhat, but not fundamentally. As we've dug into what DeepSeek has accomplished, there's no doubt that it's going to lead to some improved efficiencies, and they did some interesting things. There was this whole narrative that it cost them $6 million to do this, and that's one of these apples to oranges comparisons where there may have been a part of what they did that cost $6 million, but it's not the equivalent of what people who are building their own large language models were doing.
Because they were sort of building on their shoulders, correct?
Yeah, so without getting too far into the weeds, what they did is they took an open source AI model that was created by Meta and the team there, and then they did some of their own work on top of that. One of the stories that's emerging now is the other thing that they did is apparently they did what's called distillation, which is they used the OpenAI is alleging that they used results from their output to then train the DeepSeek
Huh.
model, which many folks are finding ironic, since, for OpenAI to saying, "Hey, you guys stole our data and are training on it," since that's kind of what they've done to the rest of the world. So
Pot
not
calling the
that
kettle
that's
kind of thing.
winning, not that that's winning them any sympathy, but it is a tactic that allows DeepSeek to be much more efficient and in their delivery of a new model that maybe isn't eligible for everybody else to follow.
Mm.
And the other thing is, it's become, there some of the analysis coming out of the semiconductor industry suggests that the DeepSeek team has had access to more hardware than they are talking about publicly, and that may have to do with some of the tensions about export of a GPU and AI technology to China.
Ah,
And
interesting.
you know well, look, there's been a lot of note of the fact that one of NVIDIA's largest markets, I think 20% of their business goes through Singapore,
Hmm.
which is an area that's had a data center moratorium pretty much for about the past 7 years. So, there's really not a lot of new data center space being deployed there. So some people find that an interesting dynamic. But
Why is all that equipment going through there? Yeah, interesting.
so I think the bottom line is that DeepSeek's done some interesting things. The numbers are not the earth shattering sort of change that people had initially assumed. And the other thing is, the whole US China arms race in AI, I think there's an alternate interpretation where it might, sort of continue to prompt, very rapid building and development of US capabilities just to try and stay ahead of the Chinese here. So it's an interesting dynamic that, just for, because I knew we were going to have this conversation today. I am part of a large LinkedIn community that follows the data center sector. And I asked my followers, I says, do you think that this is going to mean less demand, more demand, or about the same? It's the before versus after on DeepSeek. And about 60% of people are like thinking it's pretty much hasn't changed the game, that
Interesting.
expectations are about the same. 15% think it will be lower. And there's about 20% of people who think that demand will actually accelerate. There's a phenomenon in tech known as Jevons paradox, which Satya Nadella of Microsoft discussed at length at the introduction of their earnings call last week, was essentially that as technology becomes cheaper, the adoption of it accelerates. And as a result, even though you might think, well, you can't charge as much for that now, the amount of usage creates other economic opportunities.
Hmm.
And there's some very serious history of that holding true in some parts of technology, cloud computing being a great example of that. And there's folks who are saying, well, look, what this is going to do is, if the cost comes down, it's going to be more accessible and we'll need more of it. And then we'll need more infrastructure for that too.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, then we've got 60% saying it's about down the middle. They don't see it changing much. 20% see it increasing, actually, the need for data centers and electricity increasing. And only
Yes.
15% think that this DeepSeek phenomenon is going to cause a decrease in the amount of demand forecast, the amount of electricity demand forecast. So we got 80% either down the middle or think there's going to be an increase in need, and only 15% that see a decrease. That's really fascinating. It kind of runs counter to what the narrative, as I've said, I've seen in a lot of energy listservs I'm on now, where the narrative is more like, well, we told you so. We told you that there wouldn't be this much need for power once things became more efficient or something new happened in the field. Interesting.
There's an important context for this, which is that the data center industries, the demand that we're seeing for data center capacity and subsequently energy continues to be far more than certainly the utility sector can provide. What we're really in is a constrained environment. When Microsoft, for example, can't get data center space, you realize that we're in a world where, things are operating differently. So the important context here is that there's a lot of numbers out there about how much energy is going to be required. Some of these, I think, have a lot of double counting in them and are really kind of over the top. and have contributed to, a more difficult conversation in terms of what the expectations are. And there's a lot of range. I think there's no question that the demand for the foreseeable future, as far as the data center folks can see, will outpace supply. And energy is a part of that. Data center supply chain is a part of that. But, given that, I think the notion that this is going to be some sort of DeepSeek is some sort of reset that's going to solve that problem, I don't think that's what I'm seeing and not what most of the folks in the data center are seeing. Might it bring the demand closer to being in balance with the energy that might be available? If so, that would not be a bad thing, and that could be one of the outcomes from a middle path here, such as I think I'm kind of seeing.
Some of those problems that I mentioned earlier, such as consumer prices going up because of lack of supply, maybe there won't be that kind of pressure if this more middle road actually does occur. I think it's important to point out, too, that I love the fact that you raised this notion that the forecasts can be really overinflated. There is financial incentive for folks in the industry, utility industry, to look at the figures as positively as possible because so much of the approval that occurs when siting power plants, the regulatory approval is dependent on forecasts. And if those forecasts are high, you have a much better chance of getting that regulated asset approved. And of course, utilities get a guaranteed rate of return on assets transmission in particular. So it's in their favor for these forecasts to be high. One last question I have for you, Rich, and this has been just incredibly informative. Thank you so much. But one last question is a little bit different. A lot of my listeners are, as I said, people who work in energy development. And they're always trying to sort of figure out the mindset of the data center industry. I mean, it's a very important industry to them. They want to serve it. Any advice to them? What do they need to know about data centers going in?
I think that the important thing to know about them, what's happening in the data center industry right now, is that the whole issue of speed to market and competing on this AI revolution is really driving a lot of business opportunities. And I think these companies are really determined and have the capital available to pursue this whole larger goal where it's like, whether it's Google, Amazon, OpenAI, Microsoft, and Meta too, when, as there's been this whole discussion about whether or not they were going to keep spending all this money on data centers, they're all like, well, yeah, we think from a competitive perspective, we've got to do it. And we think it's going to pay off in the long run. And even if AI isn't the big thing, well, we can always use that capacity for cloud. So they're thinking on a whole different level in terms of scale because they see this larger opportunity and larger mission. And I think there's sometimes a sort of a disconnect between the two industries, but I think that there's a lot of efforts to try and work together. I think a lot of the data center folks are very focused on the nuclear opportunity. They think that that's the end game that's going to be able to address the ginormous energy demands of AI. And I think that's still a long way off. I think the most important thing is that data centers are almost uniformly becoming a better educated and a better staffed to deal with utilities, to deal with all aspects of energy, because it is really so central to them being able to accomplish their goals on AI.
It's very interesting. It's almost like the two industries are really going to, in some ways, merge, especially if the data center industry starts building more and more on-site energy. Or, I mean, some people have even said, well, they could perhaps start their own utilities or some kind of utility. It's a fascinating field, and it seems like there's just a whole lot of area right now for innovation in this relationship.
Absolutely. And look, these large tech companies have been all about innovation. Cloud computing and AI are all innovation stories. And I think that the challenge here is that when it comes to energy, infrastructure isn't as fast moving or easy to, change the world and move fast and break things.
Yeah, we can't break things in energy.
We can't break things in energy. But I think there's I really believe there's opportunity here. One of the reasons that the renewable energy that we worry about data centers using their lion's share of the utility and the renewable energy is because there's not that much of it available. I mean, really,
Mm-hmm.
when you think going back to how long there's been this understanding that we need to have an energy transition that prioritizes renewable energy and the health of the planet, and the data centers will buy as much renewable energy as is available. The reason that we're in these problems is because the growth of renewable energy hasn't moved quickly enough to address not just that sector's need, but obviously the larger economy and society.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, data centers aren't the only energy drivers in part of a transition to a cleaner economy. There's the electrification of houses, there's electric vehicles, and we really haven't seen the renewable energy growth, despite all of the impacts of climate change we may see around us and whatever mandates are out there from the Paris Agreement. It hasn't moved the needle. The opportunity here is that maybe AI will be the agent for enabling things to move quickly and to change things, and that this enormous technology opportunity that the largest companies on earth and the largest investors on earth want to invest in, they want to go all in on, that maybe this has the opportunity to make new new things happen on how we power and support these facilities.
Mm-hmm. Very good point.
Yeah, maybe for right now, natural gas is the bridge, but there's lots of opportunities. I'd love to see more projects like what Google's doing, where we use this as an opportunity to build lots of data centers, but also lots of renewable energy.
Yeah, and I think when you talked about speed to market, I think that's where distributed energy really comes into play, because you can build distributed on-site energy much more quickly. It may not always have the scale that these data centers need, but it certainly has the speed to market that they seem to need.
And that's why it's such a big hot topic right now,
Hmm.
as particularly in the short term, in a competitive dynamic. That's why on-site is, you're going to see a lot of announcements about that coming
Fantastic.
forward. And
Fantastic. You know what? We have to do this again. This has been such an interesting discussion. And clearly, these two fields are just, they have an incredibly rich relationship right now. And I think, as you said, we're going to see a lot of innovation. So thank you, Rich Miller. This was a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate you being here.
oh, glad to have the discussion. I love talking about data centers. Someone who's been covering this industry for 25 years, things have never been more interesting than they are right now. And I know that's true on your side of the fence as well.
Absolutely. Thank you again.
Thank you for joining us today on the Energy Changemakers podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think differently about the role of distributed energy in our society. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving us a review. You can help us shape the dialogue around energy. Go to energychangemakers.com, subscribe to our newsletter, and join our community. Together, we can make a real difference in how quickly we can make our grid local, equitable, and clean.